I would like to introduce Ryan Tardif. Ryan is a second-year critical studies MA student here at PNCA. Ryan's research interests include critical theory, popular culture, and psychoanalysis, and Ryan is going to introduce our panel.
Welcome, everybody. I want to first acknowledge that the land where PNCA is located rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tualatin, Quilapaya, Molalla, bands of the Chinook, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. We also acknowledge the systemic policies of genocide, relocation, and assimilation that still impact many indigenous Native families today. As settlers and guests on these lands, we respect the work of Native nations, leaders, and families, and make ongoing efforts to center indigenous knowledge, creativity, resilience, and resistance. In connection with those efforts, I think it is essential to acknowledge the role the United States and our tax dollars are playing in not only the ongoing displacement of the Palestinian people, but their wholesale massacre as well. We live in a country where to say that from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free is enough to gain censure of the only Palestinian in the US Congress. It's also to be called anti-Semitic. This correlates strongly with the discussion we're about to hear. Over the past several years, a concerted effort has been made by right-wing activists, chief among them far-right pseudo-intellectual Christopher Rufo and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, to demonize different words and ideas that not only threaten conservative worldviews, but are specifically chosen as scapegoats. Woke, or the so-called woke ideology, is one. Another is critical race theory. It just so happens I'm coming to this talk straight out of the Critical Studies program's class on CRT, taught by visiting scholar Che Gossett. It's a credit to the Critical Studies program that in spite of attacks on CRT, it not only continues to be a major touchstone for the program, but one that includes such scholars as Professor Gossett, and has included myriad amazing guest speakers, including Sora Hahn, Raman D.G. Kelly, and Calvin Warren. Drawing from the work of legal scholars like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw, critical race theory is mainly a legal framework, which also holds within it conceptual frameworks which are also rich for theoretical discussion. This is at odds with the version of CRT that DeSantis and conservatives would have you fear. We'll get into some of those topics, as well as deeper discussions on rising American fascism, book bans, and whiteness with our panelists. So with that said, we'd like to welcome Carmen P. Thompson, who is a historian and author of The Making of American Whiteness, The Formation of Race in 17th-Century Virginia. Dr. Thompson is a highly sought expert on race and whiteness in America and has taught at Portland State University and as a visiting scholar at Columbia University. And Christopher Ian Foster, who is the author of Conscripts of Migration, Neoliberal Globalization, Nationalism, and the Literature of New America Diasporas. He is currently a faculty member in the Black Studies and International and Global Studies departments at Portland State University. Welcome.
Thanks, Ryan, for that wonderful introduction and incredibly fitting opening remarks for this event tonight. And welcome, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for being here on this cold and rainy night for what I think promises to be a fun night. Thank you to Dr. Lipton and the MA in Critical Studies here at PNCA for hosting us. Very much appreciate you. And thanks to my friend and colleague, Dr. Thompson, for joining us tonight. So my remarks for tonight are based on a larger project it's a book project. It's probably about a year or two away. And the title of that is Fascist Times, Freer Futures, Dispatches from Anti-Colonial and Black Radical Traditions. And so what I'm trying to do, the question that I asked is, what can these two very rich traditions tell us about what's happening now? About all of the things that Ryan mentioned in their introduction, and how we can learn from that, right? So how we can understand our present and how we can change it as we think about what kind of just futures we want. And so what I found in these very rich traditions, on the one hand, anti-colonialism, and on the other, what we call the Black radical tradition, is kind of a minor stream of remarks about fascism. So usually when we think about those traditions, their main themes, though there are a lot, their main themes are colonialism, understanding it, fighting it, critiquing it, and racism. And what's interesting is that I found a sort of minor stream in these traditions, particularly the Black radical tradition, that looks at fascism, but whenever fascism is remarked upon, it's always connected with two things, imperialism and racism. Two things, imperialism and racism. And so I wanted for tonight, I wanted to focus on one philosopher, writer, sociologist, and also a diplomat, Ralph Bunche, in his remarks on fascism, imperialism, and racism in the interwar period when he's writing, and ask what his remarks can tell us about the last 10 years, the sort of reanimation of fascist politics, or the turn toward autocratic rule in both non-democratic and democratic nation states. And so the title of this talk is A Seething Cauldron, Imperialism, Racism, and the Prehistory of Contemporary Bans. And I want to start out with an epigraph from Ralph Bunche. And this is in 1926, and I'm going to focus on his writings leading up to World War II. And he says, "There is not the slightest doubt that by vicious use of propaganda, preying upon the racial and nationalistic hatreds of the peoples of the world, this universe could very shortly again be transformed into a seething cauldron of infuriated nations." And so I want to kind of use his remarks to unpack what we can think of now as the seething cauldron of fascism, fascist politics, and how that might help us understand contemporary bans on critical race theory, Black authors, ethnic studies programs, even trans bans. Fascism ignited and spread like wildfire in Europe following World War I. From Italy, its birthplace, it caught on in Germany and elsewhere, even in the United States. This seething cauldron brought with it chaos and almost burned down the entire world during World War II. It must have been an eerie time to be alive. Ralph Bunche, Black American and Nobel Peace Prize recipient, painted a startling picture back then as the world prepared for another global war. Quote, "The contemporary world, torn with hatred and fear, restive and confused, bordering on political, economic, and moral chaos, presents an awesome picture to those disadvantaged minority groups whose lot has so long been one of oppression and exploitation," end quote. His statement may be disquieting for many now, an uncanny mirroring of our own situation in the 21st century, as we witnessed a divided America, the existential threat of climate crises around the world, and a seeming descent into bigotry of all kinds, including unabashed racism. Bunche detailed how the great nations of the world were, quote, "rushing pell-mell to embrace unblushingly the old doctrine that only force will prevail in the world, that only the strong and the privileged have the right to freedom and a decent existence," end quote. As Ukrainians struggle against Russian invaders, the overturning of Roe versus Wade in the US indicates a war on women. Black, trans, and other minoritized populations in the United States face a litany of bans from the powerful right. No Black or ethnic studies in schools, no critical race theory, CRT, no drag shows or gender-affirming care, while Don't Say Gay bills deny Americans the right to freedom and a decent existence. Perhaps this is why Bunche, a Black male growing up in the Jim Crow era of legalized white supremacy, speaks directly to those disadvantaged groups when he imagines a better future. Ralph Bunche was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1903 and grew up in Albuquerque and Los Angeles. He graduated from UCLA, attended graduate school at Harvard, and taught at Howard University, one of the most prestigious HBCUs in America. He studied racism, colonialism in Africa, and worked at the US State Department before joining the United Nations, the leading international organization since World War II. There, he would broker a peace accord between Palestine and Israel in the years between 1948 and 1949, which won him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950. He was the first Black awardee. And I should mention, he wanted to decline the Nobel Peace Prize. He was unhappy with the outcome of the process for a couple of reasons. Growing up, Bunch experienced anti-Black racial discrimination throughout his life in the United States. When his family moved to LA, their landlord attempted to lock them out of their paid-for apartment after finding out they were Black. And racial segregation dictated which swimming pools they could use and which they could not. Later, Bunch railed against the, quote, vicious use of propaganda that preys upon the racial and nationalistic hatreds of the peoples of the world, and warned that this universe could very shortly again be transformed into a seething cauldron. This came to pass with the dawning of World War II a few years later. At UCLA, which was surprisingly diverse and inclusive for the time, Bunch would become enlightened through the freedom of inquiry that universities offer, and studied imperialism, colonialism, and racism. Greed, he concluded, fueled that seething cauldron. Like Martin Luther King Jr.'s later turn to an economic critique of war and imperialism, Bunch sees that, quote, these nations are relentlessly forced into conflicts and wars by their greedy, profit-motivated economic systems, which must feed on new markets for goods and capital, new reservoirs of raw materials and human labor to exploit, end quote. In addition to the imperialistic economic system that he saw in action, Bunch witnessed the rise of fascism as it developed between the world wars as a set of ideas and practices and as a state system that would almost destroy the world. And here's the point. Bunch made the connection between fascism, imperialism, and racism, which is why we need to understand all three in order to best fight it. The doctrine of fascism, he explains, quote, with its extreme jingoism, its exaggerated exaltation of the state, and its comic opera glorification of race, has now given a new and greater impetus to the policy of world imperialism, which has already conquered and subjected to systematic and ruthless exploitation virtually all of the darker populations of the earth, end quote. Here he begins to explore the characteristics or elements that make fascism fascism. In studying how imperialism, racism, and fascism work together, he shows how they intersect. They work as a dialectic, which means that their ideas color economic, political, or social institutions, and how those institutions, in turn, shape ideas in a singular process. Contemporaries like W.E.B. Du Bois would also take an intersectional approach, a term later coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a professor of law at Columbia University, and civil rights advocate who focused on the intersecting barriers and biases Black women face, and one of the founders, after Derek Bell, of critical race theory. If we take this lens and look at our own contemporary world through it, we see some uncomfortable similarities. So what do we make of this connection to a past many would like to forget? A world war on the heels of another world war. And how can we fix our now to create just futures? One way to understand injustice in the present is to take a closer look at liberation movements in the past and at the people who propelled them. What systems or ideas they are striving to liberate themselves from, and what can their philosophies and actions teach us now? How can we translate past lessons into future change? As I mentioned, my larger project draws upon two long, rich, and overlapping liberatory traditions, anti-colonialism and black radicalism, to understand our present context. The former tradition, anti-colonialism, sought to understand, critique, and challenge imperial or colonial powers who believed it was their right to conquer and exploit peoples and places around the world and in violent ways. The latter movement, often called the black radical tradition, fights racism and seeks to understand how it intersects with the economic, political, and cultural realms organizing society. If it is true what philosopher and refugee Hannah Arendt said in her reflections on totalitarianism after World War II, that racism will ring the death knell not only of Western society, but of humanity itself, then we must look to anti-racist movements, knowledge, and ways of being to create better, more equitable futures. Because racism was and is a key component of imperialism and led to the spread of white supremacist racism around the world in the 16th and 17th centuries, it is important to understand imperialism, colonialism, and the long history of brave souls who fought it and studied it. Arendt might argue, were she alive today, that understanding those forces is critical in fighting fascist politics. Usually we consider fascism a thing of the past because we think narrowly of the rise of fascist states like Italy and Germany, or of their outsized villains like Hitler or Stalin. We take comfort in their ultimate defeat. But the evidence is clear. In the past decade or so, fascist politics is on the rise yet again around the world. But why now? Historian Greg Grandin asked this very question, why now, when the world was scrambling to explain the rise of Donald Trump in 2016. And for Grandin, the story begins with imperialism itself. So the second part of the talk is called Instead, They Looked Abroad. Starting in 2008, quote, the safety valve of U.S. empire closed, gummed up by a catastrophic war in Iraq, combined with the 2008 financial crisis. Historically, the windfalls of U.S. imperialism elsewhere helped stabilize, firstly, economic, then political and social institutions at home. For example, Stephen Kinzer writes about how before 1898, quote, much of the world suffered through a series of economic crises. And the United States political leaders saw overseas expansion as the ideal way to end this destructive cycle of depressions or financial panics. That's in his book, Overthrow. These panics couldn't be solved by continental expansion as the West had already been won, i.e. colonized, and American agriculture and industry had produced too much with no more new markets. Successive US presidents decided to embrace the imperialist open door policy, which Kinzer argues, quote, might better have been called kick in the door, because in reality it was a policy of forcing nations to buy American products, share their resources with the United States, and grant privileges to American businesses, whether they wanted to or not, end quote. This historical fact is interesting because it defines US-style colonialism, which was distinct from the more formal European style. It shows how the US was able to solve domestic problems by exploiting areas around the world it saw as its overseas dominions or areas of influence like Latin America and elsewhere, particularly in the 20th century. But this solution, looking abroad, i.e. empire, imperialism, was a capitalist one and therefore only benefited the people who are supposed to benefit from capitalism. In other words, quote, the surplus production from farms and factories could have been used to lift people out of poverty. But this would have required a form of wealth redistribution that was repugnant to powerful Americans. Instead, they looked abroad, end quote. The phrase wealth distribution is a bad word in America and capitalist parlance because it rings of socialism or worse, communism, which in many circles have been roundly defined as evil. So instead of helping its own people, those in power would time and time again choose to go exploit other people to keep America great. But this wouldn't last forever, and the 2008 Great Depression marked the decline of American empire and perhaps neoliberal capitalism as we know it. Now, as the world grapples with the devastating effects of neoliberal globalization and as the US struggles with its displacement as a global superpower, the Trumps of the world weaponize, in the words of Greg Grandin, quote, the full flowering of white resentment caused by economic dislocation, and ameliorate wounded feelings, not by good economic policies, but by a return to ethno-nationalist and far-right populist messages, practices, and political candidates. So fascism in the 21st century, what is it? Fascism in the 21st century is hard to define because it both exists and doesn't, and it can be everything and nothing. For example, there hasn't been a self-proclaimed fascist state since World War II. Even the most extreme autocratic dictatorships don't now call themselves fascist. And the term itself is thrown around without much consideration. Although in some cases it is used as a highly technical term by historians, oftentimes it is used in common parlance where it can mean anything and everything bad. It is important, therefore, that we must have a clear definition of fascism, one that includes a criteria that must be met if the term is to be used appropriately. So perhaps we can start with a seemingly simple dictionary definition. What is it? The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines fascism as a political philosophy, movement, or regime, such as that of the fascisti, that exalts nation and often race above the individual and that stands for a centralized, autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader. Severe economic and social regimentation and forcible suppression of opposition. 2, a tendency toward or actual exercise of strong autocratic or dictatorial control. Okay, so that's a great start. There is a strong emphasis on nation and race along with autocratic rule or the presence of a dictator. Other views or perspectives are suppressed in the name of the people or the nation. But how exactly do we know it when we see it? And how does it work? I like Jason Stanley's use of the expansive but clear-cut term fascist politics here. His definition of fascism goes beyond a governmental type or state structure to include social systems with tools, strategies, practices, rhetoric, and ideas. These tools and ideas can be used by anyone and deployed by politicians and people, even in democratic states. In his book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them, Stanley argues that fascist politics uses, quote, fear and anger as a means to foment ethnic and religious divisions, which create an us against them mentality. In our contemporary era, he continues, quote, the effects of such talk seem clear as rhetoric now shapes the outcome of elections and makes its way into politics, end quote. The Supreme Court of the United States, for example, recently ruled that it's okay to discriminate against LGBTQ plus populations, limiting the rights of many Americans. That's 303 Creative LLC versus Elenis. This could have only been accomplished if this group of Americans were not included in the us category and relegated to the them. Since outright discrimination is frowned upon, fascist politics must use the tool of victimhood to meet its goals. Your rights are hurting me, so I must take them away. Okay, take a deep breath because we're about to dive into the deranged world of the fascist toolkit. Fascist tools include creating a mythic past or origin story to use in 2, propaganda, 3, anti-intellectualism, which includes attacking universities that might challenge fascist ideas. See recent bans on Black authors, critical race theory, and LGBTQ+ authors in schools. 4, unreality, or the move away from reason, debate, and truth. See fake news. 5, hierarchy, and this is an incredibly important one. Hierarchy, including racism, white supremacy, nationalism, or heterosexism, all of which place humans in categories with some above others and some inferior. 6, victimhood. 7, law and order, which consequently has little to do with actual justice, but with labeling some populations as already criminal as a form of social control. And 8, patriarchy, which is a system that normalizes the idea of heterosexual male supremacy. So I wanted to focus just briefly on this fascist tool of the mythic past to try to connect us to recent CRT bans. Adam Harris of The Atlantic suggests that recent CRT and other book bans stem from a conservative backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement, which moved the conversation about systemic racism into the mainstream, if but for a moment. Harris noted that, quote, in 2020, after Derek Chauvin was captured on video kneeling on George Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes, and the United States became awash in anti-racist reading lists, some of which included books and articles that discussed critical race theory, Fox News suddenly took a great interest in this idea, end quote. This wave of readings about Black experience and Black history conflict with the conservative mythic past, and therefore its future, a return to white supremacist, Christian nationalist heteropatriarchy. Of course, instead of a genuine engagement with CRT or an honest look at American history and institutions, the right wing again dips into the fascist toolkit. Racist demonization or hierarchy, see Kaepernick's ban from the NFL. The mythic past, see DeSantis or Kanye West statements, slavery was beneficial for Black people or was a choice. Unreality, studying or critiquing racism as racist. What? Victimhood, I feel uncomfortable, so I don't want my child learning anything because they might feel bad. Also what? Et cetera, you name it. Historically, there have been white supremacist backlashes to Black liberation. Jim Crow after the gains of Reconstruction, the war on drugs and colorblindness after the Civil Rights Movement, Trump after Obama, and now CRT after BLM. These backlashes rely on the reanimation of anti-democratic ideas and policies in the US, often disguised using a deranged rhetorics of freedom and or liberty. They are tools in the fascist toolkit, so to speak. Right-wing populism or fascism arises during times of severe economic crises, and we exist now in the dystopic wake of the 2008 financial crisis, which marked the end or beginning of the end of neoliberalism and brought with it waves of economic devastation across all of the middle and working classes. Those in power know that feelings of resentment, fear, and anxiety, all stemming from this instability, can be harnessed and weaponized. What to do about it? Many anti-colonial and Black radical thinkers and activists already suggested that imperialism was a kind of fascism, and in so doing provide us with answers as to why and how the United States and other powers in the global north now have increasingly moved towards fascist or autocratic practices and ideas in the first quarter of the 21st century. Ralph Bunche remembers his schoolroom in Albuquerque growing up. His friends included Native American and Mexican children, and although he was one of 2 Black children in Miss Sweet's classroom, quote, there was no differentiation, no outsiders, end quote. This way of being and his experience at UCLA offer glimpses of what real freedom, real democracy, and possible futures could look like, and can inform our worldview now. It tells us what we should fight for. Bunche's boyhood classroom represented what the future could look like: diverse, inclusive, pluralist, and non-hierarchical. Hierarchy, in fact, is one of the fundamental drivers of racism imperialism, and fascism, the very things that Bunch spent a lifetime critiquing. It was perhaps with this memory in mind that Bunch delivered a solution to the problems of the world he saw around him, and one that we might learn from. And it begins with the economy. The Western world, he argued, must, quote, have the foresight and courage to eliminate those forces in their economic systems which impel them to follow the disastrous course of imperialistic destiny. Only then will it be conceivable that a new era of freedom and development for all populations of the world might be possible, end quote. The forces of greed compel the imposition of violent and divisive hierarchies upon people. They at once justify war and bigotry, and perhaps even more insidiously normalize or make natural destructive hierarchies, masking states of oppression as status quo. To conclude, and this is from Brian Urquhart's biography of Ralph Bunch, quote, Bunch saw two essentials for a peaceful future: international organization involving every nation of the world, and the full development of the international mind or will. So perhaps this latter essential is now what we call global citizenship, what Sean Smallman and Kimberly Brown, my colleagues at PSU up the street, characterize as individuals having a, quote, duty to other people outside of their state or nation because of their shared humanity, end quote. Thank you. All right, Dr. Thompson.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm very honored to be here. Thank you, Dr. Lipton. Then great introduction. Thank you for coming out. I'm really glad to be here. It's so important that we have this conversation about, critical race theory, whiteness, and the return of fascism here at the Pacific Northwest College of Art. I've always found in thinking about issues of race and just the organization of society, that art has a way of getting at it in a way that maybe other disciplines don't, because it's focused on the contradictions in society. I mean, that's, in my mind, what good art does, is just kind of shine a light on the contradictions. So we're in a society, that's supposed to be about democracy, and yet you have such rife inequality, and you have these racial hierarchies all cloaked under this idea about freedoms and rights, where you see so many people's rights constantly being taken away or driven to be taken away. All of those types of contradictions, in my mind, is what art brings to the fore, probably more than any other place. So to be in a space having such a conversation with students and faculty and members of the community who love art and love what art does at its best, I think it's really important to have such a conversation here. And so with that, I thank you. And I know the last time we were supposed to meet before the power outage, we were on the verge of a government shutdown, right? And we were being shut down, right, because of these forces trying to, kind of a dictatorial type force trying to control society and where money is spent, kind of these right-wing political forces that has kind of this fascist strain to it, as Ian mentioned, that Stanley well kind of articulates, that kind of this control of ideas, control of money, who has access to the government resources and who doesn't, all coming out of the expansion of rights and movements across racial lines, the organization and the coordination of people coming together across racial lines and lines of various sexuality, and people kind of coming out in pride, in gay marriage, lesbian marriage, and Black rights, Black lives, Black women's issues, and various other things. And as you see these areas expand, then naturally you see kind of the rise of the tendencies in society towards fascism. You see the book bans. You see the removing of authority from Black-run cities across the nation, a rise in hate crimes against all types of people. So it's these types of questions that helped me to think about hierarchy, as Ian kind of teed up for me. I'm a historian. And so, being a historian, we like to kind of go deep and kind of dig into kind of the historical origins of things. And for me, it's about race, being a Black woman, and just trying to understand kind of the issues of race in society led me to write my book, The Making of American Whiteness. And I want to kind of talk about, how it is that I came to understand whiteness in particular, and link that to then what Ian had to talk about in hierarchy, and how it is that the historical origins of this hierarchy manifests itself in our society today, and where that impulse came from. And so I'll kind of situate that and kind of go into the history of whiteness and white supremacy in America. And I'm an early Americanist historian, by the way, so I study the 17th century, early 17th century at settlement. So just European settlement in Virginia, the first colony that became what we think of now as the United States. I study that period from 1607 to about the 1640s as my area of expertise. So when I got ready to kind of understand whiteness, and as a graduate student, I just kept finding myself having to go back, century after century. It's like, okay, wait a minute, let's just kind of start from the beginning. It goes back even before then, but for the purposes of this discussion and thinking about hierarchy and fascism in America and the rise of those political tendencies, I wanted to have that conversation in my book, and I wanted to situate that for you. And I just want to start out by reading a couple of lines from the introduction of my book that kind of helps situate this, and then I'll give a definition of whiteness and white supremacy, and so then that'll kind of ground my talk, and then I'll go into the historical origins of that. So this book came about out of a lifelong quest to answer two questions that have befuddled me since childhood. Why European people selected persons of African descent for centuries of enslavement, Jim Crow, and other institutional forms of racism and terror, and why the social order of America ranks whites the highest and Blacks the lowest. Since elementary school, I have utilized my schoolwork to answer these questions and what I consider to be the most vexing problem in American history and society since its founding: what it means and meant to be white. Those questions have driven my scholarly work towards understanding the concept of whiteness. And I will define that for you as I've listed in the book, so that we can understand that for the purposes of looking at hierarchy. So white supremacy, as I write, is not just the Ku Klux Klan donning robes or burning crosses, but it can be. It's not just an individual act of racial discrimination, although it can be that too. White supremacy is a collective set of codes, spoken and unspoken, explicit and implied, that society enforces through its institutions, governments, legal structures, education, in order to keep those deemed as white on top and every other racial group below them, with specific emphasis in the United States on keeping Blacks at the bottoms. And I define whiteness then as this expectation, sometimes an unconscious expectation, that the government will maintain laws and policies generally benefiting white people. And it's within that context that we can think about the rise of fascism coming out of instances throughout American history when there is this kind of felt belief by whites that that expectation of privilege and advantage through the various institutions in our society is not meeting their expectation. And because of that, then you see the backlash and then this move towards dictatorial type politicians like Trump and others that are happening not only in the United States but around the world, who are going to, in their minds, even if it's just psychologically, lean more towards meeting their needs and meeting their grievances and moving them back, again, even if it is just a psychological gesture, towards taking care of them, taking care of the expectations that white citizens believe that they are deserved. So I wanted to kind of ground that, and then talk about the way that whiteness and fascism are inextricably linked in America. And the way it's linked and the way how it gets its power is through this cooperation of various classes of whites. And that cooperation began historically in a variety of ways, but it is around being sure that various classes of whites had privileges and advantages, again, even psychologically, that others did not have. So as Ian talked about, the tools of fascism has to do with this mythic past. And this mythic past began in Virginia in 1607 of this American mythic past with the idea of colonialism, when Europeans decided to come and colonize in Virginia and remove the Native Americans and set up society for whites. And just the whole idea of deciding, hey, I'm gonna leave where I am and go over to another place and take over. Just that thought in and of itself, the action of doing it, even before you land on the shores, actions that were backed by the government, actions that were backed by European governments, English governments, actions that were backed by the churches and religious institutions, actions that were backed by business leaders who funded the expeditions, who funded the captains and the shipbuilders and the crews on that. All of that was a kind of a full circle support of various sectors of society and European society when they decided to make that move. So when you begin to think about that history and how it is that that came together, I want to kind of talk about the ways in which that happened. So in American whiteness began in 1607 in Virginia, when the first English colony that made up what is now the United States in Virginia granted the great charters, this kind of rules of cooperation in 1606. And that great charters, when they were colonizing Virginia, they came up with, England came up with these charters that kind of governed how it is that people would relate to one another. And the great charters said, when it began to colonize and wanted to recruit people to come and populate the area, because again, part of what fascism and whiteness does is that you have to utilize a large population of people. In order to colonize an area, you have to bring in a large a number of people, colonial people, in order to populate the area and kind of take over and colonize the space, change the thoughts and ideas, and make that land, make that settlement into kind of the image of the colony. And they did that by recruiting various classes of European people coming over. And they told those people that all the people who came would enjoy all the liberties of those residing in the realm of England. So they began to set up this structure of supremacy of Native American lands, of colonizing Native American lands, by telling everyone, just come on over and you will have all the rights and privileges that you did over in England, regardless of what your station in life was. in 1607, John Smith wrote that every man may be master and owner of his own labor and land. So again, seizing that, hey, this Native American land is open, it's available, and you will have the opportunity to do whatever it is that you want. That then is starting the seed, is planting this seed of hierarchy within American society that sets the foundation up for fascism. So you had this idea of these freedoms for all European people as they came over. No regard for Native American people, no regard for their time and their space and their culture that's already been established, but just pointing to leave England, come over here, and this will happen. And you will have all these rights and freedoms for Europeans. And so you had then the coordination of the business world who invested. So when they funded the colonization of Virginia, that was done by investors who put in money to fund these trips. And just like with any investment, in return for their investment, then they got land. So just simply just say, hey, here's this land. Never mind that Native Americans were there, all of this land then is going to come over to the people who funded the expeditions. And so the early investors got larger portions of land, and then those who kind of put in less money all the way down the line got smaller and smaller portions of land. All of that then is setting up this idea for the European people who eventually would be the founders and set the framework of American society in the American Revolution. All of this was just kind of setting up this idea of expectation of land, of privileges, advantages, and freedoms. And so you had all this cooperation from wealthy whites. But you also had to have this same cooperation for less wealthy people, European indentured servants. And so they were the ones who basically did all the legwork, basically fought most of the Native Americans. They were, cleared the land and set up the structure, kind of followed the rules that the wealthier classes of whites set up for them. And in exchange for that, they were granted a lot of privileges. So even though many of them were dirt poor and weren't doing well financially and kind of risked everything to come over for this notion of freedom, they then were guaranteed certain rights and privileges. So many came over as European indentured servants, and part of their servitude, they had guaranteed rights and privileges that would help them to be able to maintain a standard of living, obviously below the wealthy elite, but then above Native Americans, and then in 16 and 19, enslaved Africans. And so when these poor whites came, they were guaranteed that they would never be enslaved, right? So, and the way we think about is slavery today, that they would never have that title. So they were given guarantees against that. And so because they were given guarantees against that, then that means that psychologically they had the expectation that I then can climb the ladder and have social mobility. And they noticed what was happening with the elite whites, and they were thinking, I can have that type of lifestyle too. And you can transpose that into today's time, because obviously throughout history and at various moments throughout history, you see the degree to which this kind of expectation of advantages over jobs and privileges that various classes of whites have been getting upset as we've gone to kind of this new neo-colonialism society. Jobs at the plants and factories have gone overseas. You still hear politicians and people like Trump say, we're going to bring back coal, and, we're going to have, oil and all of these jobs that you and I both know are gone away, but they keep saying this because that's kind of the code and the dog whistle for, I got you, I'm going to make sure that you have these advantages in the workplace. And so, and even though they don't have anything kind of monetarily to give them, psychologically, by speaking this language to them in the same way that they did to the early European indentured servants, that bought them the acquiescence that allowed the powerful to have the support of the European indentured class. And they had to make various concessions with them. many of you in your history probably heard about Bacon's Rebellion, right? And that was really about, in 1686, that they were rebelling because the European indentured servants were expecting to get land just like the wealthier class of whites were, and they weren't getting it. So they rebelled and threatened to kind of join up with Native Americans and some enslaved Africans unless some concessions were made. And so the concession that was made is that poor whites who didn't own land would be able to have the right to vote. And that immediately created a constituency of poor whites that the elite had to acknowledge and cater to, even though they didn't own property. And so because of that, then that again reinforced this idea of privilege, reinforced this idea that the wealthier whites had to give concessions to the poor ones in order for them to kind of follow the program, because obviously it wasn't enough of them to be able to do all the work and control the society in the way that they wanted. They needed to have acquiescence and buy-in by the populace of poor whites who were the majority of society. So those are some of the ways in which they were able to kind of gain, the support of the poor whites. So they had this clear path to freedom, meaning that they had contracts that dictated how long that they would serve, under what conditions they would serve, and afterwards they were given, in some cases, what they call freedom dues, 50 acres of land, and they too then dreamed of the possibility of owning another indentured servant or even an enslaved person themselves. So they were given land, and then they also kept a registry of all of these people so that they would know for sure how long, when they came in, by what means they came, and when their term of service started, so that you can keep track of when that time ended. So it showed you, by them having this system of kind of monitoring the length of their time and their servitude, that they had never planned on having this group be enslaved like African people. So although European indentured servants were treated very badly and treated, almost as bad, and in some cases, if not worse, than enslaved African people, nonetheless, because of these guarantees and because of these systems that gave them protections, that then set up them for having this expectation that the system, albeit one to where they were at the bottom of the hierarchy of whites, they still felt like that they should have some privileges and advantages. And those are some of the things that set up this expectation of privilege that gives rise to how it is that fascism tends to come out of what I call the white backlash against advancements of people of African American descent, of LGBTQ, of gay marriage, all these changes in society. As you see more and more changes in society towards racial equality and equality across gender lines and sexuality lines and pluralistically with regard to religion, that's when you see these elements rise up. And politicians know that in the United States, our society is built around white supremacy, that they know when they speak that language of rights and curtailing freedoms of other groups, or speaking directly through dog whistle to poorer classes of whites, even though they're not necessarily benefiting monetarily from it, what it does is gin up that type of support that tells them, yes, you still have my back, even if I may not get anything monetarily out of it. I still have what David Roediger calls that kind of wage of whiteness, that psychological wage of whiteness. And that is what these politicians like Trump and DeSantis and others are speaking to. So just wanted to mention that. And also too, fascism, within this hierarchical structure requires institutional support. So part of the way that they organized the Virginia society in the early 17th century is that they set up a system of structures around courts, and the courts and the churches were linked together. And so within the courts, that's when the policies and practices of punishing all classes of people happened, and they were linked together. And so it was within the context of punishment and of enforcing laws and enforcing moral codes and enforcing various other policies of how it is that people were to live in society around these ideas of behavior, kind of upholding the rules and decorum of society that of civil society that the wealthy Europeans were dictating. That then created kind of this institutional structure where poor whites then were trained how it is that they were to behave. So there were laws and policies against, marrying Native American people, of having sexual relations with African American women. There's this one case where an a European indentured servant named Hugh Davis went ahead, had sexual relations with this black woman, and he was brought in the 1640s. He was brought before the church court and kind of shamed and having to be whipped and having to make penance amongst all the people for quote unquote lying with a Negro. So it's those types of ideas that were policing European people and telling them not only were you privileged and not only were you not to fraternize with these people, but just setting up this idea of expectation and hierarchy. And some of the other ways that this hierarchy was reinforced is that from the beginning, enslaved Africans, when they arrived in 1619, they were immediately called Negroes, right? So European people were called, John Smith, Fred Thompson, whatever their names were. European people African people were only called Negro. So when you have a society set up with different rules and laws and policies about freedoms, for example, and then you add then this moniker of Negro onto it, then you're setting up kind of this social distinction in society that tells European people that enslaved Africans, Negroes, are enslaved. They don't have the same rights to land and freedoms that European people do. So you set up this dichotomy in society of this expectation. And there were laws for African people about their freedom. So throughout the time from 1619 all the way until the Civil War, the only way that African people could be freed was through manumission, meaning their owner would free them, or they would buy their own freedom. So historians and history very much is a part of kind of the politics of fascism, because it's historians who continue to perpetuate kind of this mythic past and this virtuous past of the United States. And one of the questions that historians, even to this day, kind of argue is whether the early African people in Virginia were slaves, and whether or not this whole notion of race that we think of today was even in existence in 1619. I argue that it was. I argue when you left Europe and England to come over and colonize, that you can see whiteness from that point and even before. But nonetheless, in thinking about this whole notion of a mythic past, historians today argue that African people were not enslaved. And I'm thinking to myself, even as a graduate student, well, wait a minute. The only way you can be free is if you purchase your own freedom, and the only way, or have your owner manumit you. But I'm not a slave. Now, I was just a graduate student then, but that didn't make sense to me. I'm sure it doesn't make sense to you. But even to this day, if you go into the literature, rarely will they say those early Africans in 1619 were enslaved. They will call them some form of unfreedom because it wasn't in law that you're black and you're a slave. So because they didn't have any law, then historians will say, well, we didn't have that. That then is a part of this mythic past of, yes, we didn't have slavery, or, oh, it was a sin, but we didn't start out this way. Because what would it mean if we started out with black people being less than whites? What would it mean if the start of our society, if we said, as I argue in my book, that it's white supremacist. If that is the story that you and I were told when we were in grade school, then what would that make then the United States, right? That would make us monsters, right? You start out a society that's white supremacist and anti-Black, right? But we know that that's what it is, right? But we just say, oh, that was the sin, and then they say again that there was no race. Historians to this day will say there was no race from the beginning, and they kind of think of like the race that we think of today, the social structure of race with whites on top, blacks on the bottom, and all the other races in between. The one that we operate on today, I argue, was there from the very beginning. Historians even today bicker over that, and then they try to say that early on that was not a racial system. But again, if you're kind of moving out Native Americans, colonizing their land, telling them that not to marry them, telling them that calling African people Negroes and enslaving them, and then whites then, even the lower classes, always have this right to freedom, in my mind, that's a racial structure. And that hierarchical system is part of the ways in which we can think about how it is that fascist politics was grounded in our initial settlement that came through our society from the beginning. And so with all of that, in conclusion, I'd like to then just kind of say that although this cooperation is kind of built into our society and normalized in our society to where we don't kind of notice, whiteness in the way, in the kind of, because we always think of it in kind of the Ku Klux Klan kind of way, and we don't think of it from this institutionalized framework, whereas within our courts and within, laws and within, the medical, mass incarceration, drug policies, we see all of these types of things within our societies. This began early on and in our society at our founding. And what I argue and what I recommend for us today is not to buy into that cooperation. We here, I'm assuming all of us here, understand that our society has been organized in a way, not only from a white supremacist standpoint, but from, as we said, and Jason Stanley said, and Ian said in his remarks, from a patriarchal standpoint, from, kind of a dominant male perspective, to have maintained certain gender and religious norms, norms of heterosexuality and privileging that. All of those things are kind of bound up within fascist politics that I argue within the context of white supremacy kind of feed white supremacist notions historically. And I challenge you to notice these systems in society when you see them and not cooperate with them, not play into the framework of fascism that's often contextualized within the context of freedoms and rights and parental rights and, banning books because we don't want our children to kind of learn about the history of white supremacy from our founding and how it was that African Americans and African people, Native peoples were taught. Banning these things then is part of kind of a fascist agenda to try to utilize our education system to not have people understand and learn what our true history is so that we can change it. As Ian knows, and during my teachings, when I teach African American history and Black studies, I found that students from across racial lines and backgrounds don't know this history, and when they find it out, they're upset because they felt like that, one, they think it's wrong, and two, they kind of had a sense about it, but they weren't sure how to talk about it, but then they want to do something about it. And you see that change is happening. And another thing that I want to say to you is not to be discouraged by all of this that's happening. The reason why it's happening is because society is advancing, right? If the backlash and rise in political fascism politics of fascism wasn't happening, then that means kind of the status quo is okay. The fact that they're fighting so hard tells us that we're doing our job and that change is happening. And I want us to be encouraged by that, to keep up the fight and not buy into the framework of difference and distinction that our society under capitalism and all of these other isms is set up to divide us, right? In a democracy, you cannot have rampant inequality, and students and people on college campuses and in our society are realizing that this inequality is not right, and they want to do something about it. And so I think we're in a moment of opportunity rather than one to be feared. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
I'm going to give Dr. Foster and Dr. Thompson a moment to respond to one another's remarks, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience, and I'll run around with the microphone when we're ready for that.
Great, thanks. Well, I first of all, it's an honor to be on stage with you, Dr. Thompson. So appreciate you and appreciate that talk, and I thought it might be a good thing to do at an event called Ban This. Regarding books is actually to plug a book. So if it's okay with you.
Can you hear me? Okay.
There we go.
Yes.
Yeah,
I'm here.
nice. So I wanted to quote a quick passage from the introduction that Dr. Thompson read from, particularly about this, what I think is a really brilliant refiguring of whiteness and racism and the social construction of race and white supremacy, and particularly privilege. And this is this idea that Dr. Thompson gives us about expectation, that whiteness is a set of expectations, which I think is a brilliant way to kind of contribute to and reframe the way that we think about racism and how it operates, white supremacy, and how whiteness works. In ways that I think really help our understanding of what's happening now. So if you'll allow me, I might read a passage or two and then just ask you a question about this idea of expectation. And this is for everyone, of course, but particularly the folks in the critical race theory class. I wonder what you think about this. So on this first page, and this is the Making of American Whiteness, Carmen states that whiteness is an expectation by white people, sometimes an unconscious expectation, that the government will enact and maintain laws and policies to benefit them. This practice, which has been effectuated throughout all institutions that govern American society, is white supremacy, the hierarchical ordering of human beings based on phenotypic or physical attributes that we call quote-unquote race. But the daily ongoing expectations of privilege are whiteness. And that an ironic characteristic of whiteness is the inability of white people to fully perceive the historical depths of their whiteness, as well as the social, political, and economic benefits of being white. So this idea of whiteness as an expectation or a set of expectations, I think for me really helps and goes a long way in terms of understanding how racism works. And I thought you did a great job of connecting that from 17th century America to now. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about how you came to this idea of thinking about whiteness in terms of expectations, a set of expectations.
Thank you, and thank you for quoting that. I spent a lot of times thinking about that because it is such a hard subject to think about. I mean, scholars and people have struggled to define, as I said, what is whiteness? What does it mean, and what has it meant to be white? And so when I went to the records and did my dissertation research at the Library of Virginia in Richmond, who has like the records back to the 1630s. I mean, it's amazing the records that they had. And as I was reading the notes and the records, is that European people were coming here to colonize Virginia, and even over on the continent of Africa before, with other European nations like the Portuguese and French and Spanish country, Spain. They were going over to Africa to colonize because they had this expectation that they should have be, kind of a global power, have access to land and resources, and just be able to just have unfettered access to whatever it is that they wanted. But I think that was one part of it. But I think what helped drive it home was how it was then that they were able to recruit the poorer whites, and how they got them to kind of acquiesce to being, held in check and lorded over by the wealthy. And that was through this expectation, because oftentimes they didn't get much for it. And that often came, they had to nearly riot in every circumstance, and even today, threaten politicians with, not showing up or not voting before, and that's the way they kind of get action. In many ways, this expectation is a intra-racial dynamic. So when I think of whiteness, I don't think about interracial problems between blacks and whites, as you might think. I think it's really more about intraracial amongst classes of whites, that is the problem of white supremacy, of hierarchy, because how it is that you get the various classes to cooperate and to go along with it. How do you get these lower class people to cooperate with basically just kind of going along with just being taken advantage of and not given, the things in society that they expected. And they did that through kind of this hierarchical ordering. So as I thought about, in the records, what I read and what I saw, I came to the idea that really what this is an expectation that they're going to get something. And when they don't, is when the backlash happens, when, again, these fascist tendencies come about. And even at the top, trying to maintain that control. So this expectation that, kind of white male dominance in the political realm and in the world realm, as you brought out, globally, with the imperialism, this expectation that kind of white men would kind of rule the world, so to speak, when they began to start enacting, various policies to make sure that happened, they had this expectation as well, but they couldn't do it without the cooperation of other nations, other European nations, and of various classes of European people. And so when this all came together, I'm like, wow, there's a lot of expectation within that context. And so that's what kind of struck me.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I appreciate that. And when you were speaking, I was kind of thinking that we can historicize this moment,
right?
And so we can think about CRT bans in Florida or ethnic studies bans in Arizona as no less than the white supremacist expectation to change history itself.
Yeah, yeah.
And so this isn't new, this editing of history in a white supremacist way. And that's why your book is so interesting, because you can think about, you're writing about the 17th century, but it's relevant today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about history, or ask you a little bit about history. Sure. Here, and this is, you're quoting the great Cedric Robinson here, and you say that, and so this is about editing history from a white supremacist perspective and that expectation, and excising black history and black knowledges from so-called universal history or Eurocentric or white-centric history. As you say, the fact that leading historians exercised immense psychic and intellectual energies eradicating the significance of Nubia for Egypt's formation, of Egypt in the development of Greek civilization, and of Africa for imperial Rome. suggests a lot about the Black radical tradition as a source and methodology for understanding whiteness and more broadly white supremacy. And so we can think about CRT bans as a part of a larger history, a longer history, and a larger project. And so the sort of whitening of history isn't new. You can think about ancient Greece, for example, as multiracial, and the many great African contributions to Western civilization. And it wasn't until the 19th century, under European imperialism, that history would be Aryanized, would be edited to create a myth that there's this separation,
Right.
where Greek is this white source of
Yes.
Western civilization, and Africa is this other place that had nothing to do with contributions to civilization itself, which is not true.
Totally not true.
And so, like Martin Bernal's Black Athena
Yes.
talks about how that happened and would reach its extreme under Nazism,
Yeah.
right, with Hitler and the sort of extreme Aryanizing of history and editing that history. And it's just so interesting that we can think about that in terms of this expectation
sure.
that we can change history itself to suit our own needs.
And we do. I know Peniel Joseph talked about it in his book, the Third Reconstruction, that we look at history like a lullaby. It has the beginning, in the middle, and this kind of, hey, happy ending, I mean, approaching Thanksgiving, no less, right? Here we are, right? And Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1419. We have all these little ditties and things, and even though we know it's not true, we still say it, and it's still in our minds, and it governs what we say. It's like, yeah, we had that, but there's no better system in the world, and what we did is not that bad, and that was our former sins, but we're past that now. No, we're not. But people are noticing that, as I was saying. And so, yes, this kind of separation, we see that so much. And I would think about it as a graduate student when I was taking classes. Just the whole notion of Western civilization as a field of study, right? I mean, that's about as much as you're going to get until you get to graduate school, practically. I mean, how do you study Asia? How do you study even the continent of Africa? Egypt is a whole separate. This is what got me. It's a whole separate study of Africans. So, like someone who calls themselves an Africanist, they don't study Egypt. There's a whole Egyptology, which I didn't even know was a thing until I got to graduate school. But we have taken Egypt out of Africa. And of course, why would we do that? Well, all the advancements in technology, mathematics, all the things that came out of Egypt, if that then was associated with Africanness, then what would that mean for the story that we've told ourselves about African people? So even in the universities to this day, Egypt most often is not taught within African curriculums. That people who specialize it, Egypt is a whole separate specialization that has nothing to do with what we would think of sub-Sahara Africa. I mean, even in that name, right? So you have that to divide, quote unquote, Black Africa from, North Africa, So we're very clear of using maps, right? A study of maps will kind of tell you all about race and whiteness and white supremacy and this expectation. So getting to the international from your work, and the way that you, quote, bunch in that Black radical tradition of understanding kind of this global world and this connection of the Black experience to global systems of oppression, I think is so profound and it's so interesting because it gets us to kind of think about how it is that the Black radical tradition understood white supremacy, not only from what was happening here in the United States, but more broadly what was happening globally, which I show in my book, thinking of the Making of American Whiteness. England learned from other European nations like the Portuguese, like the French, about what white supremacy and global power looked like. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and just to respond to that importance of the global aspect of it. It's important to think globally. Ernest Renan said, and I'm going to butcher this quote, but the nation is invested in its own forgetting.
Right.
And that it tells the story, it tells this particular story or edits this particular story that we were talking about. And so we can't really think about, and you mentioned this in your book as well, but we can't exclude the United States from larger global processes.
No.
Racial capitalism beginning in Europe, the Black Atlantic, colonialism, imperialism. These are global processes that take different shape in different places, but they're part of a global whole, and so that we need to be aware of that and think globally. And then just to kind of come back to that idea of editing history, whether from the perspective of the social construction of a race or from a particular nation. So nationalism is something that we have to be very, very aware of and careful of as well, because that interplays with that editing of history. And so if we want to challenge that whitening of history, Aryanizing of history, that is a part of that global white supremacist project, it's important to do the opposite. And what I tell students when, for example, so I teach in Black Studies at PSU, and when I teach Afrofuturism or racism, I make the argument, or maybe state the fact that Black studies, Black authors, including CRT, is a public good.
Mm-hmm.
It's a public good and should be made available, and is a resource like clean water or air that should be readily available. And to kind of riff off that Hannah Arendt quote where she says, really, racism is the doom of Western society and humanity itself.
Yeah.
So the opposite of that is this idea that Black history, Black experience, ways of being, epistemologies, ontologies, are important for society as a whole.
Yes.
Gives us a way of understanding history and institutions and the world around us. And so the sort of challenge or the rejoinder to the bans, to the white supremacist excising of history is to recenter that which is under threat of erasure. So Black histories, Black knowledge, Black literature.
Well said. You want to take some questions, or?
Okay, I want you to think of your questions. And now I want you to think, who really needs to ask the questions? Because we don't have that much time. So I'm going to answer. Put your hands up if you really, really want to ask a question. Okay, I'm going to let 3 people ask their questions. Do we have time? Okay. I'm going to start with Tina, Alex, and then Emmy, and then we end.
Hello. I am really fascinated with, I'm sorry, I have sinuses, so my ear, it sounds weird. I'm really fascinated with the idea of whiteness being kind of like this expectation. And I'm really drawn to that idea and thinking about contextualizing it right now with the genocide in Palestine. And so, I'm sorry, I'm like articulating this as I think it. So if whiteness is expectation, and white supremacy is the service of this expectation as well as having the expectation, with the genocide of Jewish populations during the Holocaust, and kind of like the shock of that happening in this idea of expectation, where that it was never expected to happen to a white population in the same sense that it has happened globally and historically to other populations, mostly populations of color. Do you feel like the idea of, because it's so shocking, the victimization that later leads into Israel, now leads into Israel, is that kind of like victimization of post-Holocaust for the Jewish community is uplifted through that white supremacist expectation as well. Does that question make sense? Okay.
You want to? Okay. You know, I think you're getting at something because, I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with the work of Frank Wilderson and Afro-pessimism, and talking about then kind of this, you know, the death of the black body and the gratuitous violence against the black body. And so I think what your question kind of points to is when the potentiality of that violence then being turned upon European people and kind of the angst, I believe, that's kind of in the background of some of this expectation and some of this backlash in the realization within the various classes of whites that, you know, but for black bodies, this same thing could be happening to me. Right, and so I wrote about that in Ryan Dundon's important book, Protest City. If many of you have read that about the protests in Portland regarding after the murder of George Floyd, and those were happening around the world, but specifically in Portland. But to think about how it is intra-racially amongst whites, how it is that they not only understand gratuitous violence against blacks, but within the context of the Holocaust, what that turning of that gratuitous violence means for the potentiality of whites within the Jewish population. So I think those are important questions to kind of understand this kind of simmering backlash and grievance as various classes of whites kind of understand their own marginality within a kind of a global capitalist society and their own vulnerability. I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, that's great. And all I would do is cite an important figure in both the anti-colonial and black radical tradition, and that's Aimé Césaire. He in a book called Discourse on Colonialism, and you may know this quote, but he says that the thing about Nazism and the rise of fascism in Europe that shocked Europeans, given the fact that European imperialism had been doing those exact same things, genocide, enslavement, just other places in the world. The shocking thing was that this expectation of whiteness that groups won't be treated as colonized populations were, right? So those expectations weren't met for Césaire.
I guess my question is kind of similar. We were talking in class too about like how this kind of like the fear of the colonizer is like if the people I'm oppressing rise up against me, they will do to me what I did to them, and I've been quite brutal to them, so that isn't good for me. And I'm wondering, I guess from either of your perspectives, like how much that kind of fear factors into like both the definition and the maintenance of whiteness, like against other populations, if that question makes sense, and like either consciously or subconsciously of like that hierarchical and like retributive framework.
I'm thinking about how it is that various groups of whites kind of respond to that by buying into a lot of the book bans and buying into a lot of the anti-Blackness and anti-LGBTQ by just kind of supporting the oppression of other people. And and so I think kind of this growing fascist tendency in politics towards kind of the banning, trying to control thought and controlling ideas. I think that then is a way that is helped to kind of assuage some of the fears of this retribution that may be out there, and so this continually trying to change the narrative and kind of promote this contradiction, almost utilizing the same tools of oppression to kind of show how it is that freedom can be realized, and how it is that even some of the oppressed groups of people sometimes buy into these same ideas. So I think that it's important to kind of recognize kind of that as a tool in the fear, but how it is they then will harness that fear in order to, kind of maintain the order. Yeah. Great questions, by the way.
Hello. I noticed in this conversation that nobody has really gone into talking about religion and how religion plays into all of this. And I'm speaking as somebody that comes from a very Christian state, and I feel like I have had a firsthand experience in how that interacted with the political era that I grew up in, as well as the myth making that I felt informed my education. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering why, or if you see any connections between the hierarchy that you're talking about and the fact that whether you want to talk about monotheistic religions or maybe religions that have an afterlife, to me those seem like the basis of using being able to leave that little bit of mystery to justify the cruelty, I guess. And so I get a little frustrated when we don't talk about how manipulative, I guess, and not even necessarily religion as a thing, but the way it gets deployed in the public. Because you were talking about 1600s, and when I think of that, I think of all the religious iconography that was very whitewashed. Yes. As well. And to me, that all informs that entitlement. I guess I don't know if there's a question in that, or if you have anything to expand on with that.
For me, I have a whole section in the book on the church and religion and all the ways in which that promoted hierarchy, but also promoted and kind of controlled the white population and kind of kept them at bay with this hierarchical system within whiteness. But the degree to which the church not only kind of funded the colonization and colonial settlerism, but also too thinking about how it is that this whole notion of patriarchy and the maintenance of patriarchy comes right out of the church. These kind of gender norms that the current backlash against LGBTQ and trans rights, gay marriage, all of that is coming out of the church, and aspects of the Black church as well. And so religion is very much a part of kind of setting up hierarchy from the 1600s into the present, but because it also then is privileging, race, maleness, women staying in their place, and all of these other strictures and kind of this new notion of a nuclear family. All of those things comes out of religious tradition, but there is a lot to say about that. And so when you think about whiteness and white supremacy and the maintenance of that, the church, history, departments and scholars, all of that goes hand in hand in the proliferation of whiteness and white supremacy.
Yes, I agree with that. And did you know that coming in at 33% reporting as non-religious, that Portland is the least religious city in the whole U.S.? And so I looked that up. So I taught at Jackson State University in Mississippi. Yay. In the past 10 years, yeah. Oh my Are you from Mississippi? Okay, great. We'll have to talk about that. So I may have lived in the last 10 years in the most religious place and the least religious. But so just I agree with everything Carmen said, and as someone who kind of studies in post-colonial, anti-colonial studies, it's important to make sure that we think about the ways in which that the imperial project was deeply, deeply tied into religion, Christianity. The mission went hand in hand with colonialism, and so as you mentioned, that was it's replicated all over the world, and then here as well. I should also mention so that by and large it's a hierarchical, oppressive set of institutional ideas and practices. However, there are liberatory strains. So if you think about the Black church, its contributions to civil rights movements, there are those the moments of resistance and liberation that you can find there.
For sure. Well said. Is that it?
Bonus question to Randy. Then we end.
Okay. Gotta have to reconfigure what I was gonna ask here.
Yay.
I was
great
kind of
flyer.
curious. Both of you can respond to either aspect of this, but I was curious how the concept of expectations and whiteness, how it played into specifically like the lockdown era, the pandemic, and also I'm kind of curious how this is kind of like a personal research interest thing, but I was kind of curious how either like disability or eugenics kind of tie to like larger, like imperialistic, kind of larger political economy type things like that.
So yeah, I mean, when you think about, the lockdown, and I have the right to go to school and I don't have to wear my mask and I don't have to get my shot, all this idea of, this kind of control, telling what to do, not thinking of the health of other people, that my individual rights, supersedes, the rights of the masses because I think of myself as having kind of more rights and more privileges than everyone else, and expecting then the state to be able to reinforce that and support that. And getting upset then when, teachers and other vulnerable populations who still have to come to work and still have to kind of deal with that, and oftentimes those people are poorer people and people of color, that can't stay home or can't, set up school in the garage, and have everyone in the neighborhood come over to their house, that people were still having to go to work. So you had this kind of class divide about this expectation of what, who has the right to, be free from vaccine or from, potential of getting sick and being harmed by that, kind of taking on kind of a class and racial dynamic within society that way. And I don't know, you want to respond more?
Yeah, just so this idea of this expectation that I can change science itself.
Right, there you go.
So you mentioned eugenics,
Yes.
and it's interesting because there's a period in history where in the 18th and 19th century that racism moves from a little bit more of a discourse of theology towards a discourse of science. Really, it was pseudoscience. So it was white supremacy using discourses, terms, phrases, languages, and using science essentially for its own white supremacist ends.
Yeah.
So this white supremacist expectation that science will be my own weapon, as it were.
Definitely. Just kind of upholding this idea of superiority. You mentioned eugenics. I mean, that's kind of what that is all about, the whole eugenics movement. And, who has the right to have kids, who can take care of themselves. I mean, all sorts of things kind of come out of that, kind of experimentation on Black women's bodies, You go through, you've heard the horror stories of, anesthesia, doing surgeries without anesthesia. But even in modern medicine today, many of you, I think it's Harriet Washington, Medical Apartheid, her book kind of chronicles kind of the history of race and medicine, the disparate impacts, regardless of income, insurance, how it is disproportionately affected Black people, Black women, and other people of color and poorer groups of people within their outcomes, medicines being attacked for even, trans rights and those types of things today, like who can have abortions, who can have healthcare services, who may be in a period of transitioning, and having access to the medical support in that realm. All of that and pushing back against that is of this expectation of white supremacy and white privilege, and the fear then that they then won't have, the people who buy into this won't have, that privilege because various classes of whites and other people are not buying into that, which is why I kind of ended it with like, it's up to us to recognize that and not cooperate with that and call it out when we see it. And like I said, which is why I love being on around artists, because I think they just kind of have an eye and a keenness and kind of understanding these contradictions in a society. And when they put it out there in whatever medium that they choose to use, it just goes right to the core. And I think that's beautiful.
Thank you so much. Make art, read critical race theory. Have a good night.